students, Mr. Yun here with Chapter 23, Lesson 1. It's called Seeking New Frontiers. This lesson, really the whole chapter, is kind of taking a big step back. We've been looking at things like who are the presidents, what are their policies. Really, we've been following a linear path in history, mostly through presidencies and major events like wars. So today, this whole chapter, we step back, kind of looking back a little bit and saying, how was our country expanding physically as well as influentially? So let's take a look. This isn't a very long lesson. Alright, so a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, no. It was actually this class. George Washington warned us all about the dangers of political factions, and he also basically told all the following presidents to stay out of the business of other countries and avoid wars. Some argue that Washington only meant that, to stay out of wars and trade with foreign nations was good, but others argue that he was a straight-up isolationist, which means we keep to ourselves in all matters. Regardless of, Washington's policy, we stayed out of international wars and stuff like that. Pretty much kept to ourselves for 100 years. We're, however, growing in our North American continent, pretty much expanding, filling the house, if you will. And expansionism really was a major factor of all of American history. I mean, we learned about that for the whole year. Oh, and then the Louisiana Purchase, and then the Mexican-American War. We gained more land, and then the Oregon Territory. And today we're going to actually talk about Alaska. So, heading toward the 1900s, America saw opportunities in expanding trade and influence around the world. In 1853, Commodore Perry, same guy from the Battle of Lake Erie, steamed into Tokyo Harbor with an impressive fleet. He had 4 ships, steamships, and he had a letter from then President Millard Fillmore, asking Japan, somewhat firmly, to open up trade to the United States. He said he'd come back in a few months for an answer. It was pretty much a show of force, a posturing move, and when Perry returned, Japan agreed to open up 2 ports to American traders, basically because they were intimidated, and they thought if we isolate ourselves, Japan had been very isolationist, that we would kick their butts. So they opened it up. You see here, it was feudal Japan when we landed there. Alright, an age of imperialism. You see, in the 18 and early 1900s, the world was in the age of imperialism, which you may have learned about last year. I can't quite remember. I know 8th or 7th grade learned about it this year. Basically, the most powerful nations of the world, your Frances, your Britons, your Spains, and that kind of like, were subjugating less developed nations and using them to make big money. Africa and Asia were basically carved up like a pumpkin pie on Thanksgiving by the major nations of the world. Their people and raw materials would be shipped back to the imperial nation, and they were basically like cash cows. The whole world had been carved out, leading a lot of competition in the world, which would kind of culminate with World War I. The U.S. was a little less about conquering an empire militarily and more about kind of conquering them economically with, say, foreign investments. Though the United States was going to have its share of conquests, as we'll learn in this chapter. Moving to Alaska, in 1867, then Secretary of State William H. Seward, who was a big fan of expansionism, arranged for the purchase of Alaska from the Russians. The price was $7.2 million, which was a bargain for a chunk of land twice the size of Texas. However, most people thought of Alaska as a frozen wasteland. So that's why they got such a good price. People jokingly called it Seward's Icebox, but they were no longer making fun of Seward when gold was discovered there in the 1890s. Little random tidbit. Alright, so we have the world of imperialism and we have expansionism. Basically, all these Western European countries are taking over the rest of the countries of the world. Most of it was economic, but they, at the time, managed to come up with sort of a moral justification, a cultural justification for taking over all these other nations. It's sugar-coated in your textbook, but Mr. Young is going to just tell you how it is. It's called the white man's burden. So they had this philosophy that it was up to them, the white man, to civilize the rest of the uncivilized world by taking their culture and religion and spreading it to them, so that by basically taking them over and making them, say, in India, Britain may have them farming cotton, and by doing this and teaching them Christianity and European culture, they were making them better. So that was the sort of the moral justification of what they were doing with imperialism, and it was a part of the United States as well. They thought that way as well. So, random tidbit, your book kind of glosses over the sugar-coated version. Moving on to U.S. expansion. So, now we've got that out of the way. Latin America, in the late 1800s, the U.S. turned its eyes to its southern neighbors. But we weren't going to conquer them, but there was a lot of interest in expanding trade and making money. In 1889, Secretary of State James Blaine invited many of the Latin American leaders to Washington, D.C., where they hashed out the Pan-American Union, which was a sort of agreement of cooperation between all the nations in the Americas, be it North or South, and the Caribbean. Tomato, tomato. Alright, one more nugget on the Navy. There's not much to say here other than with the U.S. having aspirations of becoming, expanding beyond its own borders and having worldwide influence, they needed a bigger, stronger Navy, and that's what they got. By sort of that late 1800s, remember learning about the first ironclads during the Civil War, and they knew naval warfare had changed forever, so ships switched from sail and wood to steam-powered and steel. Bigger cannons and better technology. By 1900, the U.S. had an impressive navy suited to the task of expanding America's role in the world. That's it for content today. There's a short quiz on the next page, only 5 points, and we're going to get into lesson 2 soon. Alright, if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, have a wonderful day, alright?